Accountants often have the need to quickly analyse data. Now, this can be achieved with the use of pivot tables. In this video, you're going to get a brief introduction to how to use pivot tables, how you can set them up, and how you can use them to quickly analyse data. So we're going to use the same table of data that we used in our tables example. This is already converted into a table for us. So that means that when we update this table, our pivot table and everything else updates too. So when you're working with data and you want to create pivot tables, make sure you convert it into a table first. Once you have your data in table format, you can, from the insert ribbon, select recommended pivot tables. Recommended pivot tables are great for people that are new at working with pivot tables, as it will recommend certain pivots for you based on your actual data. So we can see here that we have the total sales by the product or the total sales by the region. Let's select this particular pivot table. Now, when we select a pivot table like this, a new sheet will open with the pivot table on the sheet. Now we're going to go back to this table sheet for a second, and I'm just going to show you when you insert a standard pivot table, you must select from a table or from a range. This will then select your data for you. Now we have our table named, so this is the name of the table. We then have the option to put it on a new worksheet or an existing worksheet. Let's put it on a new worksheet. In this case, you will be given a blank pivot table. Now notice with the recommended pivot tables, we were given some data, and with the blank pivot table, we're given a blank canvas. Now we have this pivot table fields list, and I'm going to drag this over so we can see it. The pivot table fields list contains all of the fields that are in your table of data. So the columns that we had in our table of data was date, invoice, region, product, quantity, price, total, and total too, because we had added that additional column. Using the field list, we can then add the fields to the rows, to the columns, or to the values. Now our pivot table field list, we have some options in, so we can change how this is displayed. Sometimes people prefer to have more visibility of what's in their rows and columns and prefer to have their field list side by side to the actual table fields. So you can select between these in here. Now anything that you add to the rows, so we can take our product, we can basically drop it into our rows, and we see that the rows on our pivot table have been populated. We could then say, let's take the region and put it in the columns. When we put it in the columns, where do you think it's going to go? Well, it's going to go across the columns in our table. But we still need to add a value, and values are added in this value field here. So let's add in our total, and that shows us now our total sales by region, by product. Now the thing with a pivot table is once you have your data selected, you can quickly pivot this data and view it in different ways. For example, let's say we no longer want the region anymore. Let's say we wanted the invoice number instead. We could place our invoice numbers across, or we could switch them around. And when we switch them around, we first have our product, and then indented then is our actual invoice numbers. Now when we have our pivot table set up this way, we have these little buttons, and we can expand and collapse the data within these buttons. Now, dependent on how many levels down, you can add additional levels down if you want to add additional levels down. Now, you'll also notice that when we have our data set up in this way, and I'll just expand one of these, that we get our totals and we also get subtotals. When you're using a pivot table, you can customize what is actually shown here. If we go into our design ribbon, we have the option to turn off our subtotals, and you'll notice our subtotals have now been removed. We can also turn off our grand totals, so we can decide whether we want totals on our report or whether we don't want totals on a report. From our design ribbon, we can also change between available designs, predefined styles of pivot tables, or You can add in your own pivot table if you want. Now, in addition to the design ribbon, you also have the pivot table analyze ribbon. In the pivot table analyze ribbon, all pivot tables are given a name. We see this as being called pivot table 4. From here, we have the option. We can see that the active field is product. We can insert slicers, which we seen earlier on with tables. So inserting slicers is the same with pivot tables as it is with normal tables. You get all of the column headers and you can select the slicers that you want to have within your pivot tables. So we've now selected 2 different slicers, and by using these slicers, we can filter the data further down. I'm going to open back up our pivot table field list, and my pivot table field list came on just when I selected data in the actual table. What we haven't looked at is the filters option, and the filters option, let's add region to our filters. When we add filters, it allows us to filter the data set further down. So this is kind of separate to slicers, but again, it's a way to quickly slice down your data. So I'm going to remove the filter from in here, and I'm going to remove the invoice in here, and I'm going to also remove these slicers as well. So I'm just going to select the slicers and delete the slicers. Now, at the moment, what we have in our pivot table is we have the total sales by the product. But what if we wanted to show this as a percentage? Well, what we can do is we leave in our total sales and we'll drag our sales in again. But this time, if we select from the drop-down value field setting, we can change this to the average. So this would give us the actual average. Just to show you, we there have the average. So let's change this back to sum. And if we go into show value as, we have loads of calculations that we can choose between that Excel will automatically carry out for us. For example, percentage of grand total, percentage of column total, percentage of row total. And if you scroll down, there's plenty more in here, such as running total, difference from, ranking smallest to largest, and so forth. Let us select percentage of grand total and say OK. So now we have the percentage of the grand total. Now we can make some changes in here. For example, if we don't want this to show as the sum of total, we can delete the name. We can have percentage sales and change the names as required. If we don't want this to say grand total and just say total, we can have it to say total. Now, it's very easy. Once you have a pivot table set up and formatted, you can then use that pivot table as a base for another pivot table. So we can take a copy of this pivot table and we can just paste this pivot table here. So now with our new pivot table, if your fields list does not appear, if you go to pivot table analyze and select fields list, your fields list will now appear. We can remove region, or we can remove product and replace it with region. And now our pivot table has very, very quickly updated with the new figures that it is that we're looking for. Now from pivot tables, we can also insert pivot charts. So if we go to our pivot table analyze, we can quickly insert a pivot chart, a recommended pivot chart to go along with our pivot tables. So I'm just going to pull this up here. And we see this pivot table also has the filters here. So you can filter between the different products. And when our table here updates, everything else will also update. So let's go back into our original table and let's put in some data in our original table and make sure that our pivot table is working. And we will call this South and we will say product, and we'll give this a new product. And the quantity being 100 at 20 each, and we see our formula updates. Now, if we hop over to our pivot table, and in our pivot tables, if we quickly just select our pivot tables and say refresh, our data updates, our pivot table updates. You will also notice that our chart updates as well. So that is a very, very quick introduction to pivot tables. You will find an exercise so you can practice some of this, but pivot tables are Definitely a core feature of Excel that all accountants should know how to use.